Howdy folks, in this video I'm going to be showing you what happens when you use a measure inside of Calculate, which is another example of using a revisor inside of Revisor. Now in this particular thing that I'm going to be showing you, this is going to be something that you will see and write over and over and over again throughout your career. And that's why it's really important before you do that, before you write this this sort of pattern 100,000 times, to see how it works, because it's entirely possible to go through your entire DAX career without having sort of a mechanical understanding of what's happening, and one step in particular. Okay, so yeah, that'll be more interesting when I show it to you, and I'll talk about it then. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started on this, shall we? So I'm here in Filter Revisors Part 1.xlsx, and I'm in the Measure in Calc tab. And here we have a snippet of code, right? So here we're going to use the calculate revisor. We're going to revise the filters, and then we're going to run the sub-expression, right? And here the sub-expression is simple. It's just a simple call to a measure, right? Which we've got defined down here. And once we add the filter, you'll be able to see this all at once. I'm going to scroll down just a little bit, okay? Okay, so what's going to be interesting here is when calculate revise the filters and run this sub-expression, since the only thing in here is a measure, and since measures are revisors, the measure also will attempt to revise the filters again and then run its sub-expression. So this is actually an example of two revisors, even though you might not think it just by looking at it. So let's sort of walk through this. So here we are, we're looking at our snippet of code, and the very first thing we see is the calculate function. And so whenever we see a calculate, the first thing we want to do is freeze the sub-expression. Now, I guess I'm a little inconsistent with this. So the sub-expression is really anything here in the first argument. I'm just going to freeze stuff between these two green lines right here, which I think is a little different than before, maybe a little easier to understand. So I'm going to right-click on that, and I'm going to go ahead and give it this blue background because we're frozen it. We've frozen it. The reason we're freezing it, or have frozen it, is because this is what's going to run after the revisor revises the filters to create a new filter context. So it wants to run this after it makes this change right here with this one override filter. Okay, arguments 2+. Okay, so what's our override filter? Well, we're going to go get all the different values of type. We're going to use this all column derivation to say, go get me all the different types, all the different values in the type column, ignoring the filters. That's what this all function does. So here we've got type to go and dine in. Well, there's no filters, so there's nothing really to ignore. So let's just go get that temp table, right? So here on line 6, we're going to get this temp table right here where we get type, and we're going to get to go and dine in, right? Simple as that. Okay, so those are our two different types. That's the result of the derivation on line 6 right there. This produces a temp table that looks like this, all the values of type, ignoring the filters, right? Which then gets passed into the filter iterator, which says I'm going to add this column to it, and I'm going to just keep the true results. That's what the filter function does, okay? So we're going to add a column to it with this definition, and thankfully, because I'm lazy, I've already done that, so I'm going to type in exp, and as soon as I hit enter, notice the formula is pre-populated. So for every single row, check to see if that row's type is equal to go. We get a true on the to-go row and a false on the dine-in row, as you might expect. And so what does the filter iterator do? It just keeps the true rows, so that one and not that one. And so we get a new temp table that looks like this. To go. There we go. So that temp table right there is the result of the derivation. This temp table is the result of the entire block, lines 5 through 8. So this produces that temp table right there, which calculate then says, okay, I'm going to take that temp table and add it as a filter to the filter context. That's what happens with arguments 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 1000 of calculate. Anything past the first argument is an override filter that calculate's going to add. So let's go ahead and select that, and I'm going to move it into the filter context, assuming I can get my trackball to work. There we go. I got my arrows. I left click and I drag. And it's more accurate to say that I make a copy, but I'm going to hold down Control. I'm sorry, it's more accurate to say that I move it, but I like making a copy, so I'm going to hold down Control to get my little plus symbol right there, and I'm going to let go, and now I have a copy, right, because I like to see it in both places. Okay, so Calculate has taken this temp table, added it to the filter context, and so now we've got a filter context of type equals to go, so let's go ahead and reflect that up here. This is what the model looks like as far as the code is concerned. Good. Okay, so now Calculate can unfreeze this sub-expression and run it. So let's go ahead and select the sub-expression, right-click. Let's make this gray. There's a little puddle behind it. We just melted that big block of ice. So this is the sub-expression which we can now run in this new revised filter context. Okay, So what's in the sub-expression? Well, just a call to a measure, right? And what is a measure but a reviser? It too is going to revise the filters and then run a sub-expression. And if we look inside the measure, right, you may not be used to thinking of it this way, but everything inside that measure is the sub-expression of the measure. So when you define a measure like this, everything past that equal sign is indeed the sub-expression, the thing the measure will run under a revised set of filters. So I'm going to go ahead and select this down here, and I'm going to freeze it. There we go. So it's frozen. Okay. So we're running this sub-expression. And inside the sub-expression is the reviser, which is going to revise the filters and then run its sub-expression. Well, here's its sub-expression right here. It's frozen. So now the total units measure is going to revise the filters. Now notice there's no additional arguments to the measure. We'll actually see how you could do that in a future video. In addition, we're not calling this measure as part of an expression column. So there's no current row to add as filter. And measures, like all revisers, are going to attempt to add current row values as filters. Well, there's no current row. If there's any override filters that add those, well, I don't see any override filters there. There's an override filter for calculate. It's right there. But the measure doesn't have any override filters. So the measure, it goes to revise the filters, and we basically tell it, don't make any changes. It says, okay, what changes do you want to make? We say none. It says, all right, I guess I'm done. The total units measure says, all right, I'm done not making any changes to the filter context, or I'm done making 0 changes. I can now unfreeze this sub-expression and run it. So I'm going to right-click here, and I'm going to unfreeze that. And now we can run this sub-expression, right? And this sub-expression is going to run under the filter context of type equals to go. Calculate, added the filter for type equals to go. Then the measure changed the filters, but when it changed it, it didn't make any actual changes, right? That's a little counterintuitive, but it's worth noting, right? Measures are filter revisers. So when we call it, it's before it runs a sub-expression, it basically looks around and says, hey, are there any current row values? Since it didn't find any, there were no changes to make, which is why this sub-expression runs in the this filter context right here, which is identical to the one the measure got called in. Okay, so now we're going to do the same thing we've done a whole bunch. We're going to go get all divisible rows of mini. We're going to add this column to it, and we're going to sum up the results, right? So I'm going to go ahead and select this right here. Control-C to copy. Come down here. Control-Alt-V to paste special. Paste special values. Click OK. All right. So this temp table right here is the result of the derivation on line 4 of the measure. Line 4 of the measure, which is running inside of line 3 of our code snippet here. Okay. So now we're going to pass it into the sum iterator, which is going to add that column to it as an expression column and sum up the results. So I go up here, I type in EXP, and I've already got the formula pretty popular. For each row, we get the units, so I get 2, 1, 3, and 2, right? For each row, get that row's units, 2, 1, 3, 2, and we sum it up because it's the SumX function. So I go ahead, I do equal sign, sum, and I'm going to go ahead and sum up these numbers right there. And I hit enter, and the result is 8. Now, in practical terms, like this is the actual answer that we're going to get. But just to be, I don't know, extra specific or extra, I don't know, technical or something, we're also going to clean up the filters because revisers are excellent roommates, and so they clean up after themselves. So the total units measure changed the filters, or tried to change the filters, so it's going to set it back to the way it found it. So total unit says, all right, this is the current filter context. What did it look like before I changed it? Well, it looked the same, so I don't have to clean anything up, which is very convenient, right? It's very nice after a party to not have to clean anything up. Okay, so total units doesn't have to do any cleaning. Then calculate, which happened outside of the measure, says, all right, well, now it's my turn, right? Total units is done cleaning up the filters. Now I have to clean it up. What changes did I make? This is what it looked like when I was done with it. What did it look like before? Well, before I didn't have this type equal to go to filter. So let's go ahead and get rid of that. So calculate's going to clean up after itself. Control V and escape. And there we go. So now calculate's done cleaning up after itself. And it takes that number 8, and that number is the actual answer. Or to be really specific, right? The measure down here produces the number 8, right? Which it cleans up the filters and passes that number 8 to the calculate function. And calculate says, okay, I want to return the number 8 as an answer, but before I could do it, I have to clean up the filters. Calculate cleans up the filters, and then it takes that number 8 and says, that's the actual answer to this little snippet of code right there. Cool. Let's go see one more example. Let me clear the filters right there. I guess I should have been changing this as I changed the filters. That's okay. I think you guys get the idea. Okay, one more. And I'm going to sort of scroll down here just a little bit, give us as much room as possible. And again, we'll be able to see this whole thing once we do that initial filter revision. Okay, so here we've got calculate. And so what we're saying is we're going to revise the filters and then run this sub-expression. And here's how we're going to revise the filters, the change we're going to make. So cool, let's go ahead and freeze our sub-expression. We're going to freeze that right there. And there we go, frozen in a big block of ice. So this is the thing that we're going to do after we revise the filters. How are we going to revise the filters? Go get all the values of shift, pass it into the filter iterator, which is going to add this column to it to check if each row's shift is equal to lunch, and just keep the true rows, return a temp table, which is going to pass to calculate, which calculate will add up here as a filter. Cool. So, hey, what are the different shifts? Well, there's lunch and dinner. Keeping in mind this is the all function right here, so this all derivation, if there were filters in place, it would ignore them. There's not, so we don't really have to worry about it, but if there were, it would ignore them. Okay, so we get all the different shifts. So I'm going to come down here. I'm going to type in shift. We're going to get lunch, and we're going to get dinner. Still no breakfast. Still no breakfast service at this place. Sad, sad, sad. Or brunch, for that matter. Okay, so we get lunch and dinner. We pass that this is the is the result of that derivation right there. We pass it to the filter iterator, adds that column to it, keeps the true rows. So I'm going to type in exp right here. We're going to add that column to it. So we're for each and every row. We check to see if that row shift is equal to lunch. Does lunch equal lunch? Sure, it does. True. Does dinner equal lunch? No, it does not. False. We're comparing the text strings right there. So what does the filter iterator do with this expression column? It just keeps the true rows, giving us a temp table that looks very much like this. Well, actually, not very much like this. It looks very much like, I'm getting myself confused here. That right there, okay? Shift equals lunch. So this is the temp table produced by lines 5 through 8. Calculate says, cool, I know what to do with temp tables. I add them to the filter context when they're provided as additional arguments, anything past that first sub-expression argument. So calculate says, I'm going to add this as a filter. So I'm going to select this right here, and I'm going to move it. So left click and drag. Now, it's more accurate to say that I move it, but I like seeing it in both places. So I'm going to hold down Control. It's going to give me a little plus symbol on my mouse there, on my cursor right there. And I'm going to let go and make a copy of it. Okay, so now I can see it both there and there, which I find convenient. Again, more accurate to say that I move it, but I like seeing it in both places. So, hey, now we have a revised filter context with shift equals lunch. Let's go ahead and filter it down up here. Filter it down up there. Good. Okay, so now calculate says, all right, I've created a new filter context. I'm done revising the filters. I can now unfreeze my sub-expression. Unfreeze it. There we go. We got the hairdryer out. Threw it in the microwave for 30 seconds. It's got this puddle behind it. We can now run it on under this revised filter context. Well, what's in the sub-expression? The only thing in the sub-expression is a reference to the total sales measure, which is defined in our model. You can see it down here, right? So what are we going to do in this sub-expression? We're going to revise the filters and then run another sub-expression, right? So total sales, it's not as simple as run this sub-expression. It's revise the filters, then run this sub-expression, okay? So we're actually revising the filters twice, okay? So total sales says, okay, I'm a reviser. All measures are revisers. Before I can do anything else, I have to check to see if there's any current rows to add as filters. Now, if we were running this total sales as part of an expression column, it would take any values of the current row and add them as filters, but we're not, right? Oh, I should say, before we even check that, and I'll say it again just to be redundant, total sales is going to run this sub-expression in a revised filter context. Let's go ahead and freeze this to remind ourselves this is going to run after we revise the filters. So this is what's going to run after we revise the filters, right? So when you define a measure, anything you define in there is that measure's sub-expression, right? So how is it going to revise the filters? Well, just like calculate, there's current row filtering and override filters. So the first thing the measure is going to do when it runs right there is it's going to look around and say, hey, am I being called as part of an expression column? Is there a current row right now? If this was being called as part of an expression column, it would add the current row's values as filters. However, we're not. There's no SumX or MaxX or anything like that. This is not being called inside of an iterator. Therefore, there's no current row values to add. There's no current row filtering to do because there's no current row. All right. Are there any override filters? Well, it's kind of hard to even think about what they would look like. I'll actually show you that in a future video. But there's nothing here in total sales that indicates, like here, that we're adding an extra filter. So there's no current row filters and there's no override filters. So the filter context that it get, it didn't end up making any changes to it, right? It didn't end up making any changes to it. So this is both the old and the new filter context as far as the measure concerned. It got this. It looked for current row values, didn't find any, so it didn't change the filters that way. It looked for override filters. We didn't provide it any, so it didn't add any of those. So the new filter context is the same as the old filter context. But it did try to change it. It did look around to see if either of those things were true, if it had to make either of those changes. Okay, so since it's done revising the filters, it didn't have anything to change, but it did try. It's all done now. We can now go unfreeze this sub-expression and run it in our new revised filter context, after a second round of revisions. Okay, so I'm going to right-click here. I'm going to select this, and I'm going to click on that right there. So we throw it in the microwave for 30 seconds, right? We unfreeze it. And now we can run this sub-expression in this revised filter context, which has been revised not once, but twice. The second time didn't do anything, but we're technically revising it twice. That's what we're asking for. We're asking to change it here, and we're asking to change it there. Okay, so what are we going to do now? Well, this is pretty easy. We go get all the visible rows of many, right? We're going to pass it into the SumEx iterator, which is going to add this column to it and sum up the results. Oh, we've done this so many times. So let's select that right there. Control-C to copy. Come down here, Control-Alt-V to paste special. Click on Values. Go ahead, hit OK. There we go. That is the derivation produced on line 4 of the total sales measure, right there where we ask for many. We go get all the visible rows of many. Now we're going to pass it into the SumEx iterator, which is going to add that column to it, that expression column, and sum up the results. So I'm going to come up here. I'm going to type in EXP. And I've actually already filled out the formula. So as soon as I hit enter, hey, there we go. For each and every row, we multiply the units times the price per unit, because this is the total sales measure, not the total units measure. So for every row, we take the number of units and multiply it by the price per unit. 2 times 7 is 14. 1 times 9 is 9. 1 times 7 is 7. 3 times 9 is 27, right? So that's the expression column. And what are we going to do with it? Well, we're going to sum it up, because this is the SumEx iterator. Equals sum. I'm going to go select those cells right there. Goes to parentheses. I hit enter. And I get 57 bucks. So 57 bucks is the result of running the expression, right? And that's sort of the answer. But before we go away entirely, right, revisers are good roommates, and they clean up after themselves. So before this number 57 actually gets returned as the answer, right? Oh, that should say 57 right there. I changed the code at the last minute. This used to be units, right? And so I'm going to do Control-V. And oops. Control-Alt-V to paste special. Let's do values. Hey, there we go. 57. Much better. Okay, so this 57 is going to be the answer. Right? But the measure is going to clean up after itself, and then calculate's going to clean up after itself, because revisers are excellent roommates, and they clean up after themselves. So total sales, it's got that 57 bucks. It's going to return it as an answer, but before it does, it's going to clean up after itself. And it's going to say, okay, what are the filters? This is what the filters look like now. I need to return them to the state that I found them. Well, I didn't make any changes. So this is actually both the result of my changing the filters and how I found them. So nothing changed. Good, I'm all done. So total sales is done, setting the filters back. It takes that 57 bucks and passes it to the calculate function. Calculate says, okay, good. I want to pass back that $57, but before I do, I have to clean up after myself, right? So this is the filter context when I was done changing it, but I need to change it back to the way that I found it. Well, what did I do? I added this filter for lunch, that one right there. So let me set that back to the way I found it. Control-C. Whoops. And I select that right there. Control-V to paste special, or to paste, do regular paste. There we go. So calculate's done setting the filters back. It can now take that 57 bucks, and that will be the actual answer right there. Okay, so here we can see, I mean, this is a very common thing. This is the kind of thing that you will do all the time, where you're going to use the calculate function. Argument 1 isn't going to be some big, long snippet of code. It'll just be a reference to a measure, right, that will run under that revised filter context. But it's important to note, that when you call the measure, it's going to try and revise the filters, right? When you run a measure, whenever you run a measure, right, even in a situation like this, it's going to attempt to do both current row filtering and override filtering, right? Because we don't call this as part of an expression call, there's no current row values to add, so it doesn't have to make those changes. I'll show you in a later video how we could add override filters to a measure, but we're not doing that here, right? So it doesn't end up making any changes, but it is worth pointing out that whenever you call measure, it's going to attempt to change the filters. That's one of the things that a measure does. It always attempts to change the filters before running its sub-expression. So when you see something like this, it's very easy to get confused and think to yourself, oh, that reference to a measure. The measure is nothing but the sub-expression. Well, it's a sub-expression run under a revised set of filters, because a measure does both of those things. Revises the filters, then runs its sub-expression. So whenever you see something like this, keep in mind you've got not one, but two revisers. In a simple case like this, it won't matter, but if you practice thinking that way, when you start to write more and more complex DAX, you will be able to spot where your problems are, because you understand whenever you see a measure, you are indeed seeing a revisor. Easy to see with calculate, a little harder to see when you write it as a measure. Okay, I sure do hope that was helpful, and I will see you in the next video.